You've been taught farming started once, in one place, by one clever group of people who figured out planting seeds beats chasing animals. That story is too clean. And it's mostly wrong. Farming didn't start once. It started at least 7 separate times on 4 different continents by people who had never met each other, who had no idea anyone else was doing the same thing. No shared language, no trade route, no contact of any kind. And yet, all around the same narrow window of time, human beings on opposite sides of the planet independently arrived at the exact same idea. Let's start with the one you know, the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Israel, around 12,000 years ago. Wheat, barley, lentils. Archaeologist Ofer Bar Yosef spent decades mapping exactly how this happened. And the picture he pieced together is nothing like the version most people imagine. Slowly, not overnight, not a light bulb moment. Wild grains were harvested by hand for centuries, maybe longer, before anyone deliberately planted a single seed on purpose. People were gathering wild wheat the way you'd pick berries, long before they ever thought to plant a row of it themselves. The shift from gathering to growing wasn't a decision. It was a drift, a slow accumulation of small choices that eventually became irreversible. Here's the twist nobody tells you. The old theory says farming happened so people could eat more reliably. Straightforward, practical, boring. But archaeobotanist Patrick McGovern has a very different theory, and it's a lot stranger. He argues humans domesticated grain to brew beer, not bread, beer. Think about the logic for a second. Grinding grain into flour, kneading it, baking it, is labor intensive. It takes tools, time, and skill. Fermenting grain into beer is almost effortless by comparison. You soak it, you let it sit. Wild yeast does the rest. Get drunk. No oven required. If McGovern is right, one of the biggest turning points in human history might not have started with hunger at all. It might have started with the discovery that fermented grain felt really, really good, and people wanted more of it. At the same time, on the other side of the planet, something identical was happening. Nobody was talking to each other. Nobody was sharing the idea. There was no possible way for information to travel between these places. And yet, in China, around 9,000 years ago, farmers along the Yangtze River began deliberately cultivating wild rice, selecting the plants that held onto their seeds longest instead of scattering them to the wind. In Mesoamerica, around 9,000 years ago, farmers began experimenting with a scraggly wild grass called teosinte. It barely resembles food. Small, hard kernels, nothing like the corn you know. But give it a few thousand years of patient, repeated selective breeding, choosing the best-looking cob generation after generation, and it slowly transforms into corn. In New Guinea, one of the most isolated places on Earth, cut off by mountains and ocean, farmers were independently cultivating taro and bananas almost 10,000 years ago. In Africa's Sahel region, an entirely separate group of farmers domesticated sorghum and African rice, again, completely independently, with no connection to any of the other 4 regions. That's at least 7 separate agricultural revolutions. Same basic idea, same rough time frame, 0 contact between any of them. So why did it happen everywhere, all around the same time? That's the real mystery here, and one leading theory points to the climate. The last ice age ended around 11,700 years ago. Before that, the planet's climate was volatile, unpredictable, swinging between extremes that made any kind of long-term farming almost impossible to sustain. Then the planet warmed, stabilized. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, weather patterns became reliable enough to bet a season's worth of labor on a single crop. Suddenly, wild grains were more abundant, more predictable, more worth investing real time and effort into. Stability didn't force farming to happen. It created the opportunity for farming to actually work. But here's the part that ruins the clean version of this story completely. Farming didn't make humans healthier. It made them sicker. Skeletal remains from early farming communities show a measurable, consistent drop in average height compared to the hunter-gatherers who came right before them. Shorter skeletons, weaker bones. Bioarchaeologists have found increased tooth decay in farming populations, a direct result of diets suddenly dominated by starchy grains instead of varied wild foods. They found more vitamin deficiencies, more infectious disease spreading easily through close, permanent settlements packed with people and often livestock in a way that scattered hunter-gatherer bands never experienced. Jared Diamond, the biologist and author, called the agricultural revolution, quote, the worst mistake in the history of the human race. He wasn't exaggerating for effect. He was pointing at the evidence. Hunter-gatherers, on average, worked fewer hours per week than early farmers. They ate a more varied diet, pulled from dozens of different wild food sources instead of one or two staple crops. And they were, on average, taller and healthier than the farmers who came after them, right up until relatively modern times. So why did we do it anyway, if it made life worse? Because farming, whatever its costs, produces dramatically more calories per acre of land than hunting and gathering ever could. Even if each individual calorie is nutritionally worse for you, more calories available means more births can be supported. More births means more people. And more people, once you cross a certain threshold, means you simply cannot go back to hunting and gathering, even if every individual involved wanted to. There isn't enough wild food left to support a population that size. It's a one-way door. Once a population commits to farming, once it grows to depend on that surplus, it locks in. There's no version of the story where they changed their minds and returned to the old way of life. And once that lock happened, everything else followed from it. Farming built permanent settlements because you can't wander after a herd when your entire livelihood is rooted in a field that takes months to mature. Permanent settlements built surplus food because a good harvest produces more than any one family can eat before it spoils. Surplus food built specialists, people who didn't farm at all, because for the first time in human history, someone else's labor could feed them. Builders who raised the first permanent structures. Priests who organized ritual and belief around the harvest cycle. Soldiers who now had something worth defending. Rulers who controlled who got access to the surplus and who didn't. Every hierarchy you've ever lived under, every government, every economic system, every social class structure traces its roots back to a surplus of grain sitting in a storehouse 9 or 10,000 years ago. So here's the full picture. Farming wasn't one invention, born from one flash of brilliance in one place. It was at least 7, arrived at independently by people solving the same basic problem with the tools and plants they happened to have around them. It wasn't a leap forward in human health and well-being. For those first generations of farmers, it was often a measurable step backward. It wasn't some inevitable, destined next step in human progress. It was a one-way ratchet, a set of choices that clicked into place, generation after generation, and simply never clicked back. And it might not have started with a rational calculation about food security at all. It might have started with something as simple as the discovery that fermented grain felt really, really good, and that feeling was worth chasing. Every single meal you eat today, every piece of bread, every bowl of rice, every plate of corn is downstream of a decision made independently by strangers who never knew each other existed on 4 different continents, roughly 10,000 years ago. They weren't trying to build civilization. They weren't thinking about empires or hierarchies or the shape of the world 10,000 years later. They were just trying to get through the next season. Civilization, as it turns out, was the accident.